what do you think is the strongest point from that performance?
What I really like is the way that she develops the topic throughout her talk. I think she does it very, very consistently and in a very interesting manner. I love the way that she uses long, complex sentences, and she uses some unusual vocabulary. I love hearing these topic-specific collocations, these words that go together to make your language a bit more interesting.
You know, something I realized after our sessions together, I realized you're a guy that really loves details, in the sense that you like the qualifying, statements, you like the adjectives, you like the descriptions, you like, the relatives.
Yeah, this is definitely something that all students should be aware of, that I always want to hear conditionals, relative clauses, and all of the tenses from the past to the present to the future. It's definitely something people should be revising and practicing constantly. Makes a more interesting conversation.
In terms of other people, when they talk about a topic like journey or traveling, what do you think they should be talking about?
Okay, well, it can be a very, very open topic. And in terms of ielts, really, you can talk about anything in a part 2 topic. So, again, the 5 W's are your best friend. Talk about where you went, when you went there, who you went with. Go into a lot of detail describing, your best friend who you traveled with and the place that you traveled to. What were the special features of that place and why did you go there? And then maybe move into the future and talk about whether you would like to go back there again. It shouldn't matter in the IELTS exam, it shouldn't matter, but I think it does matter because you're learning English in order to go and study maybe in another country or to study in a university here. And basically, you want to have interesting, engaging conversations. So I think that IELTS is a good chance to practice having those conversations. And so I would try and encourage students to pick on a topic that's a little bit unusual and makes them stand out. And talking instead about maybe some more unusual features or characters or things that people don't usually talk about.
I didn't understand the full history, but actually she made it very clear to me. Very interesting.
So what did you like about that performance?
Well, I was very impressed actually. I mean, I think her fluency is outstanding. She's easily able to give long answers. She can go quickly without stopping too often. Gave some really good examples. I thought she was outstanding in her fluency.
Wow.
And pronunciation, I was very impressed.
Yeah.
Easy to understand throughout. Very natural sounding. She uses word stress quite a lot for the important information.
Yeah.
Very.
Wow. What are some of the good phrases or vocabulary that you picked out from that?
But I think throughout the whole test, she used very natural vocabulary. A few mistakes here and there, but nothing serious.
All right. Let's take a look at what she thinks of her performance. All right, Tuhoon, what do you think of your performance just now?
Well, I don't know how how to say now. I was quite nervous, and I think I did it not as good as I hoped, but yeah, it's quite good enough.
All right, so she mentioned something that she was nervous. You know, she was really nervous, but it didn't seem like she was nervous at all.
Not at all. She seemed very confident.
Very.
Actually, he only just gave me the questions and looked straight at me. But you know, sometimes he looked down or he looked at the stopwatch, and it really made me confused. I thought that, wow, the time is gonna over and I have to speak it faster, faster, and faster. But actually, only part two, right? Only part two that count the time, and the part one and part three I can say as much as I can, but I didn't know that. Just try my best to speak it.
They have to follow the time very strictly because IELTS is a standardized test around the world. It always has to be between 11 and 14 minutes. So it's completely normal for the examiner to be looking at the watch because they have to stop each section after a certain amount of time. It means you've said all that you can say. So don't worry too much about the timing. That's the examiner's job. But just say as much as you can say, and the examiner will control the time. But my advice is just ignore the time and just keep talking as much as you can say.
So that's a good advice. So don't be nervous when the examiner is looking down. You know, sometimes we get very nervous when people do that.
Exactly.
But yeah, don't be nervous, and you know, just keep on talking and keep on saying until you're stopped. How many points do you think you got, Thu?
I think I didn't do it good enough, so maybe about 6 or 7.
Good enough, 6 or 7. What do you think about that?
Well, 6 or 7 is certainly good enough, but I think she would be higher than that. I think her fluency and her pronunciation are definitely higher than that.
But if you had to do it again, what would you do differently?
If I have a chance to do this test again, I think the most important and the most problem of mine is about vocabulary and grammar. I have to improve my vocabulary, and my grammar should be more kind of exactly.
Yeah, she wants to do it again, and you know, she wants to improve on her vocabulary as well as her grammar. More have those aspects more accurate. How can she do that?
It's difficult. I mean, I think grammar, it's very difficult to speak perfectly in an interview like that. If people start worrying too much about their grammar, it really affects their fluency. They start slowing down a lot. And it also really affects their pronunciation because they're focusing more on grammar than on pronunciation. So my advice is just ignore grammar. It is what it is. And don't focus too much on being perfect.
What do you think about that performance?
I was very impressed. The two things that really struck me were his fluency. He's able to give very long answers. He's able to speak without stopping too frequently. And his ability to explain his answers was quite good, I thought. And the second thing that struck me was his pronunciation. He's not only very clear with his sounds, but he's also using things like stress.
Yeah.
He's stressing the key words. His intonation, where he goes up and down, was very, very natural. He said, for example, the pros and cons, it has pros and cons. He said, find their potential, experience pressure, and quite a few examples of some less common words.
And I love how he was able to share his own personal experience of the competition that he went through.
Yeah. Yeah, I really liked in part 2 where he introduced the topic before he started explaining the competition. He had a nice little introduction before he started, which is a very good technique.
If you were in his position, what would you do to make your performance a lot stronger?
I think he's already very strong in fluency and pronunciation. I think probably the area where he could improve more would be grammar. I did notice there are quite a few small mistakes. They aren't very serious, but the number of mistakes I thought was a little bit high. The one thing he could focus is maybe trying to avoid the common mistakes.
All right, let's see how he think he did. How did you think you did on that exam?
Today, I feel not very happy, and now I'm nervous about the result as well because today I was in a hurry and I did not utilize the time well, especially the question, the competition that I attended before. I think it is a nice question. However, I did not use good words, good phrases to answer my question. So I'm not very satisfied with that. And I think the performance today is not really good.
Andre, how many points do you think you got?
For me, if I mark myself, I think 5 or 5.5.
You've done this for the second time. What do you think you learned from the second experience? And
I think the tips today is listen carefully and then utilize 1 minute of preparing to have better arrangement for your answers, because I think this is an important part of the IELTS speaking test when they give you a big topic and they have some guidance about the ideas to answers. That's why you need to answer all of them and utilize the time they give you and have the better verbs and phrase. Sometimes you can use the better and logical sentences to answers.
I think he's being much too humble. I'd give him a much higher score. Like I said, his fluency and his pronunciation were outstanding. His vocabulary was good range.
but he did mention also something very important, right? To basically make full use of the time that's given to a candidate.
Yeah.
You know, if you're given 1 minute, use that full 1 minute to basically plan out what you're going to say.
During the 1 minute, it's very helpful if you write down not only your ideas of what you're going to say, but also some good vocabulary. Because if you write it on your paper, you're much more likely to use it. Whereas if you try and trust your memory, you might forget that good vocabulary. First time, towards the beginning, I was thinking that she was maybe a little bit of a low-level candidate. But the more I listened and the more she explained her ideas, at the end of it, I was very impressed. And I'd say there's one thing that really she could improve, and that would be her speed.
Yes.
She's a little bit slow to explain her ideas. But having said that, she's very accurate. I mean, I think she's thinking a lot about her grammar and her pronunciation, because both of those are quite accurate, but it's coming at the expense of a little bit slow. So if I were her, I'd probably worry less about being perfect and just try and be more fluent and just let it out instead of worrying too much. You know, some of her answers in part one were, you know, she could have explained and elaborated a bit more. But as it went on in part three, she gave some really good, really detailed, logical answers.
If I have chance to do it again, I think that is the most important thing for me is I have to improve my vocabulary. Right, because I want to express my opinion as quick as possible.
Because if it were me, if I were a celebrity in my home country and I had to do something like the Vietnamese challenge, I'd find that very, very daunting.
Yes.
So I'm very impressed that they're, how brave they are to volunteer themselves.
Yeah.
And actually, to be honest, I'm very surprised because some celebrities, I didn't expect them to have that good English.
Yeah.
Because you don't often hear them singing English songs and being in English movies and things. I've been very impressed, actually.
I'll give you a piece of information, actually. Tiêu Ngọc Linh, she's not just a model. She's also the top scorer for the University of Foreign Trade, coming into the university. So yeah, what did you like about her performance?
I thought she's able to really explain her answers. All of her answers were quite long. And for part two, I think she spoke for the full 2 minutes. And she's really able to explain clearly why she thinks what she thinks.
Yes, so what did you think was one of the strongest points of her performance just now?
I think probably her ability to keep going,
Yes.
which is part of fluency and coherence, and also her grammar. I thought her grammar is quite accurate, and she really tries to use more complex sentences.
So as a parent, you know, how would you describe your children?
Well, obviously I'm a bit biased. I think my sons are the most handsome sons in the world. But, you know, I might say, for example, my sons are the apple of my eye. So apple of my eye means they're very beautiful to me. Yeah, so for example, if my son looks a lot like me, or if my son has the same personality, I might say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
When it comes to speaking about children in a speaking test or in a writing test, what were some of the points that candidates tend to lack?
I think people often describe appearance, and Ling was an example where she described the appearance of these children.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a lot to talk about for their personality. So it's very easy to describe what a child looks like. But if you really want to extend your answer, you might talk about their personality, any characteristics, to make it a little bit more detailed.
Okay, Ling, how do you think you did on that test?
Well, my second time with the test, but I'm not satisfied with my test.
Okay, Ling, why weren't you satisfied with your performance?
Because and the second one, I didn't have enough time to prepare for the question because the topic is not familiar as the first one.
I think her strengths are probably in her grammar and a lot of her pronunciation I thought was very clear. The things that she could improve most, certainly her fluency.
Yeah.
She tends to be very slow
Yes.
and she often pauses in the middle of her sentences. And I think it's because she's trying to speak with perfect grammar. She's really thinking hard about her grammar, but as a result, that's slowing her down. And she's having to stop and think quite a lot. So, although it's helping her in her grammar, I think it's really hurting her fluency. I think worry less about making mistakes because the IELTS exam, it's not a test of how many mistakes you make. So it's perfectly okay if you make some small mistakes, but if you worry too much about being perfect, I think it really hurts your fluency like Ling.
For a person who is so busy, how do you think they can balance, the studying for the IELTS?
I mean, in the one way, they're very lucky because they have a lot of experience to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think she's a good example. I mean, for all of these questions like traveling, she's been to lots of different countries. When she talked about a child, she has a friend who's a single mom. So I think being busy and doing lots of these different things can really help you. But it's at the same time, it's very difficult to practice, especially in a country where English is not the language. So I think it's important to spend, even if it's 2 minutes a day, just doing a part 2 in the shower by yourself. Or even if it's just a few minutes to revise some idioms. I think it doesn't have to take hours and hours. It could be 5-10 minutes a day. The first thing to realize is you don't need to understand everything. We're only trying to answer the questions. So to focus on what you need to listen to, it's important to know what questions are being asked. And don't worry about understanding every word. It's not important. But really look at the questions before you listen. So I think you don't need to understand every word in the question, but you do need to understand what are the key words that I really need to focus on. There were some very difficult questions, I thought, but she handled them very, very well. And you probably noticed in part 3, the questions were getting a little bit more and more challenging. And a lot of people who might be lower level candidates would really struggle. But I think she dealt with those difficult questions very well.
Don't focus too much on grammar, just say whatever you need to say and don't look at the watch. Be comfortable and just because the IELTS itself is really about speaking about life, talking about life.
Exactly. It's a conversation. I mean, don't think of this as a test. It's a conversation with somebody. That's it. An abandoned house in part two. Part of human nature, and all of these really good phrases which were spot on. So that's the thing that really impressed me the most. And her pronunciation I thought was very natural. And the only comment I would give for her to improve is her speed.
So, in terms of speed, you know, how can a person speed up the way they speak?
It's quite difficult because if you speak too quickly, then your pronunciation will get worse. And if you speak too slowly, your pronunciation will get better.
Yes.
But it's a little bit difficult to listen to if it's too slow. So my advice for students to practice is record yourself. You really need to listen to yourself again, because some people don't realize how quickly they're speaking or how slowly they're speaking. If you could do a bit of practice at home, record yourself and then listen again, I think it gives you an idea of if you're speaking too quickly or too slowly.
I also remember something that my teacher told me back in the day when I was learning how to sing, actually.
Absolutely. It's a very tricky thing to do because obviously English pronunciation is much different than Vietnamese. But one thing that's really important in English is the consonants at the ends of words.
Yeah.
However, it just takes a lot of time and practice, really. There's no shortcut.
I think we should extend our answer by give more examples and details. Yeah, to make our answer more interesting. And I think we should practice more with our friends to feel more comfortable and relaxing. Yeah.
I like the idea of practicing with a partner, even if it's through Skype or some other video service. Then I think it's great to just get the feeling of being in an interview. And I've been watching some of the comments and some of the questions and the videos, and it's really nice to see people interacting and really practicing their English.
Talking about the Facebook page, we actually have some questions sent to you. What can I do when my mind is suddenly empty during a speaking exam?
So if your mind is empty because you don't understand the question, then it's perfectly okay to ask the examiner to repeat it. In part one, they can repeat the question. In part three, they can actually change the words and explain the question. For example, in part one, you could just say, sorry, could you repeat the question, please? Or, sorry, I don't quite understand. In part three, you might say, sorry, what do you mean by that? Or, can you ask it in a different way, please? And they'll ask a different way. If your mind is empty because you have no ideas at all, then I think the best thing you can do is try to explain something as close as possible.
So guys, you know, if you are the one that asked that question, just don't be afraid to ask the examiner to repeat the question. And of course, don't be afraid to basically speak about something that is as close as possible to that question itself.
I think he really answered the questions directly. There were times where maybe he could have explained in a bit more detail, especially in part one. I think all of his answers were right on target, exactly what the examiner was asking.
There's one thing that he mentioned that I think can potentially be a common mistake for people. He said he wanted to own some high-tech production.
So I think the examiner can still understand the idea, but in terms of accuracy, that could be considered a mistake.
Right. So he should have said high-tech
Products.
products instead of production.
The things he'd really need to do to get a 7 or higher would be to fully answer the question, so explain a little bit more, especially in his part one. And also his vocabulary, I thought, was a little bit limited for these topics. But I think with a little bit of practice, I think he could go up to a 7 or even higher.
One of the most common Vietnamese dream is to own a house, to own a car, to have enough money to go around. Because in the past, my grandparents' age, they wanted to make enough money to provide food for the family.
I mean, I think Vietnam as a country, it's developing so quickly. Compared to other countries, for example, Western countries, you know, in the past they were also poor. The development was over a much longer time. But I think Vietnam is seeing such a quick growth. And they're also very connected to the outside world. So I think those two things combined means people's ambitions are much higher than they used to be.
Yeah, I like the way that she keeps on speaking all the time. Again, I don't hear very long pauses or hesitation. I think she speaks pretty clearly throughout the whole thing. I didn't hear too many words mispronounced, so that was good. She did hesitate a little bit, and there were a few mistakes with discourse markers and a little bit of repetition. In terms of her grammar, yeah, she used a range of sentences. Again, she was using a good range of relative clauses and conditional. But there were, you know, quite common mistakes, and she does need to pay a bit more attention to that. For example, she said, if I have a chance to meet a famous people, it should be a famous person.
I don't know why I decided to do this test, or I think that I did it not very well, but maybe it's not bad.
And I'll tell you a secret after I ask her this question. But so how many points do you think you got?
Oh, I don't understand about the IELTS score, but let's make a guess. Maybe the 6 point is not a very bad point.
And I think, you know, I don't want to mention that anymore because now people expect me to speak French, which I don't anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, she only learned English through watching videos.
And I think that's great. I think that's such a good way of learning English. You know, parents might tell you off for watching TV programs and films in English, but I think it's great. It's part of the immersion in the English language that you need to get a high mark.
Learning French since I was a child, so my foreign language is French, is not English. And I never have been in an English class, and it's the first time in my life I speak a lot of English like that. And I'm just learning English by myself by watching film or by listening music. So I feel a little nervous when I do this test.
I wish that I found learning languages that simple. She's done very well.
I think, you know, if you have the love for the movies or the love for the music, then it's a lot easier because you will just memorize the lines in English.
And learning the language in context, I find, like, if you read the lyrics of a song and you learn the lyrics, then you'll be able to remember and use that language in other situations. It's definitely very helpful, but I'm still extremely impressed.
Right, so it's great to hear a little bit of French in an English-speaking show.
Sure. There are always idioms. There are always idioms related to everything. So apart from that, I think it's a really important. It's really important to remember to use topic-specific vocabulary. So if you're talking about sports, I'd expect you to be using lots of connected vocabulary, like talk about the team, the players, the goalie, the referee, taking a penalty. This is the sort of vocabulary I'd recommend people add to a mind map, and they build this topic-specific vocabulary for lots of different topics.
All right, so today we have a very, very famous person. He's quite young. He's also going to embark on his university studies soon.
Yeah, it was good. I like the way that he keeps on speaking all the time. His fluency level is pretty good. Usually if you haven't met the examiner or you haven't met a person, you should say as you might know, as you may know. In terms of his lexical resource, generally good. I mean, he can talk about every single question that's asked of him. He does make a few mistakes in there, and I don't hear many idioms. But generally, I mean, yeah, I like the way that he uses his vocabulary to talk about every topic. In terms of his grammar, he uses a really wide range of grammatical structures, like relative clauses and conditionals. But he does make lots of little mistakes with them, and I think that is something that I'd recommend that he focused on if he was going to do the exam. I would recommend that he actually maybe writes out some of his sentences beforehand, and maybe slows down his speech in order to perfect the sentences, because they're quite common mistakes in grammatical construction.
I think the best thing I can do is that I have prepared carefully and can spend all the time to take my grammar and learn more vocabulary to speaking fluently.
He did mispronounce quite a few words there. For example, I won't give the mistakes, but I'll say the correct pronunciation: chicken, vegetables, comfortable.
So when we talk about, when we talk about education and we talk about scholarships, what are some of the idioms that we can use?
Some of the idioms regarding education are things like to keep your nose to the grindstone. It means you're working really hard. To brush up on something. I'm brushing up on my English skills, means to practice them. Also maybe to rack your brains. I'm racking my brains trying to think of a word. It means I'm trying very hard to think of something.
I think she was actually quite good. The one thing that I'd really recommend for her to improve on is really explaining her answers more. And in the real IELTS test, the examiner would ask a follow-up question. So, you know, which part of your country are you from? The north. They might ask something in more detail. Instead of just answering the question directly, you should always explain more, like why, more, you know, where, who. But I will say her pronunciation I thought was quite clear. I was very impressed with her pronunciation. She's not stopping too often to think of language.
Right.
And she did get much better in parts 2 and 3, where she was explaining in more detail. I think my advice for her would be longer answers in part 1, and also maybe a little bit more advanced vocabulary would help. I didn't hear any idioms. That was one thing I noticed was missing. So normally I'd comment on some good idioms that I heard, but I didn't actually hear any idioms from that one. But she does have enough vocabulary to cover all of the ranges of questions. I was waiting for some of that really less common or idiomatic vocabulary, but I didn't hear too much of it. Get a 7, I think she'd need to work on her fluency, which is the first category, which would be speaking a little bit faster and extending her answers a bit more. And also in her vocabulary, like I said before, trying to use more less common vocabulary and some idiomatic language. I think she's close, but she'd need to do a little bit more to get a 7, I think.
As well, she speaks very naturally, and I think personally her pronunciation is a strong point.
Are you surprised by the fact that she is able to deliver the English language so well?
I'm not. From after living in Vietnam for several years, I've heard many Vietnamese students who reach very high levels of fluency. So I'm not surprised when people actually do have this kind of level. Yeah. I think being confident would allow her to just keep on talking and not worry about the mistakes that she makes. Although I would say, and I do say to a lot of my students, that if you have nerves, then that can be an advantage as well. It's not a normal conversation. You really have to show off all the range of vocabulary and grammar that you have. You do have to be aware that you're aiming to show the examiner your awareness of the past, the present, the future tenses, conditionals, relative clauses, idioms. When I was at university, I did feel a lot of stress before my exams, but it was this nervous energy which I think helped me to write faster. I think it was actually quite useful, but you need to harness that energy.
Absolutely.
I liked her pronunciation as well. It was very, very good.
Yes.
Definitely a strong point. And generally, she gets around these language problems and continue speaking, which is something we should definitely encourage.
Right. All right, so Fumwei mentioned something that's really important. When you approach it, when you are given a topic that you do not like or you do not know a lot about, what do you do?
I would be brutally honest. If you don't like something, then tell the examiner that you don't like it. And if I got asked about sports, most of my answers would be about how little I know about it and how much I'm not that keen about it. And also, it's definitely not a bad thing to admit that you don't know about something. And I think that people who admit that they don't know about something are actually stronger because they can then begin to learn more about their weaknesses. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask the examiner to clarify a question. You can ask them to repeat a question or to explain what the question means in other words. You know, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? What exactly do you mean by that? The examiner will actually do that for you. They'll change it into different language. And then if you have no idea about the topic, then be honest.
Yeah, no, I was very impressed with her fluency. I mean, she's able to speak very quickly. She doesn't stop and hesitate very often to think of her language. All of her ideas are very well explained, lots of detail. And particularly her pronunciation, I was really impressed with.
This is the second time that she is on the show with us, and I think the first time she did very well as well.
Yeah.
And I think this second time also even better.
Not expected to. It really depends on the examiner. I mean, some take their job very seriously. Others, you know, enjoy having conversations. I wouldn't pay too much attention to their facial expressions. Yeah, it doesn't really tell you your score or anything like that. I think she actually picked up. She said that she felt she made a few grammar mistakes, and I did notice some. Like there were a few mistakes with past tenses, a few collocation mistakes where not the right verb to match the noun. To be honest, those were fairly minor, and I could still understand what she was trying to say. They didn't affect her ideas too much, but I did notice probably her weakest area would be the grammar accuracy.
And of course, you know, I think marketing is, when we think about advertising, I think fundamentally we have to think about the business that it's supporting, right? Yeah.
I mean, in terms of his pronunciation and his fluency, I think he was always willing to speak, and I thought he used a good range of grammar, and he used relative clauses and conditionals and things like that. In terms of his vocabulary, he used some very good vocabulary related to marketing, like to promote a product and attract customers, very good collocations. But made also one of these typical mistakes with an intensifier and an adjective. We would just say it's really difficult to run a business.
So it's very easy to live your life just doing the same thing every day. But if you take a risk, then, you know, that's stepping outside of your comfort zone. You've exceeded the expectations of Tham IELTS. I think you are Chin IELTS. We might need to change the name of the show now.
Thank you.
No, I think you did a really good job, and I think you felt a bit nervous. Is that right?
I was very nervous. And when I get nervous, I will just speak without stopping. I'm, you know, a lot of people tell me that when I'm nervous, I speak too fast. I don't stop, and I don't organize my thought as if I was, you know, very comfortable. I was nervous because, you know, when you put yourself in a situation where you think you have to perform, then it's quite scary. And so you imagine what all the celebrities had gone through, you know, to put themselves in the hot seat. Yeah. So what's one celebrity that kind of, you know, put the most impression on you, that gave you the biggest impression, memory?
And I remember Anne Japan. I remember her really good pronunciation. I was impressed by her. I remember Ding McNing. I really liked his confidence and his fluency. And I remember, let me think, Fung Mai. I think she was outstanding. Really, really, really strong. Almost as strong as Phoebe, I think. I think my number one advice is, you know, we heard lots of celebrities after their tests say, I felt so nervous, and although this was my second try, I still felt nervous. I think the number one tip I have is trying to overcome your nervousness. Because if you're nervous, you're not going to perform your best. So doing whatever it takes for candidates to try and reduce their nervousness, particularly in part 2. That's probably the most important thing to do, is don't just read books about speaking and look on the internet about sample speaking answers, but just really practice. Get used to the feeling of speaking by yourself in English. That's number one tip for writing is understand how you're marked, because if you can tick the boxes, that the things that IELTS is looking for, you can get quite a good score. So really make the effort to understand how the examiners mark you in task 1 writing and task 2 writing. Because the more you know, the better you'll do, I think.
What do you think is the strongest point from that performance?